Carson froze mid-sentence. The microphone slipped slightly in his hand. His eyes went wide, tracking something the cameras hadn't caught yet. The studio audience, 300 people packed into Studio One at NBC Burbank, fell silent in a wave. Not the planned silence. Not the silence before a punchline. This was different. This was shock. Doc Severinsen looked up from his trumpet. Ed McMahon turned in his chair. The stage manager pressed his headset tighter against his ear, mouthing something urgent to someone off camera. And then, from stage left, the curtain moved. Someone was walking through. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Someone who, according to every schedule, every call sheet, every production meeting that week, was 3,000 miles away in New York. Frank Sinatra stepped onto the Tonight Show stage. No announcement. No music cue. No introduction. Just the chairman of the board, in a midnight blue tuxedo, fedora in his left hand, walking like he owned the place. Which, in a sense, he did. This was his era. His industry. His America. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. But how did we get here? What brought Frank Sinatra, unannounced and unscheduled, onto Johnny Carson's stage on a Tuesday night in October 1976? To understand that, you have to go back 3 hours. Back to when the show was nothing more than index cards and coffee cups. It was 3:47 p.m. Carson sat in his dressing room, reading through tonight's monologue. The jokes were fine. Typical. Ford Carter, the election. A bit about gas prices. Nothing extraordinary. Just another Tuesday. He'd done 4,000 of these. Maybe 5. He'd stopped counting years ago. There was a knock. Freddie de Cordova, the show's producer, entered without waiting for permission. He had that look. The look that meant something was about to change. "John," Freddie said, using the name only a few people were allowed to use. "We might have a situation." Carson didn't look up from his cards. "What kind of situation?" "The Frank Sinatra kind." Now Carson looked up. Freddie continued. "He's in L.A. He wasn't supposed to be. There was a thing in New York, got cancelled. He called. He wants to come by." "Come by?" Carson set down his cards. "What does come by mean?" "He didn't say. He just said he'd be here at 6. Carson checked his watch. 2 hours and 13 minutes until showtime. "Did he say why?" "No." "Did he say if he wanted to be on the show?" "No." "Did he say anything at all besides 'I'll be there at 6'? Freddie shook his head. "That was it. Then he hung up." This was classic Sinatra. The man operated on his own frequency. His own time zone. His own gravitational pull. You didn't book Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra happened to you. Carson stood, walked to the window. Studio One was on the ground floor. He could see the parking lot. The palm trees. The Los Angeles sunset starting to paint everything orange and gold. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see what Frank wants." At 5:58 p.m., a black Cadillac pulled into the NBC lot. No entourage. No security. Just Frank driving himself, which was somehow more intimidating than if he'd arrived with an army. He walked through the backstage entrance like a ghost. Stage hands stepped aside. Producers whispered into headsets. Everyone knew. Everyone always knew when Sinatra was in the building. Carson was in makeup when Frank found him. The door opened. No knock. Sinatra stood in the doorway, holding a folded piece of paper. "Johnny!" "Frank." The makeup artist excused herself. Suddenly it was just the two of them. Two men who'd shared stages, shared friends, shared the strange burden of being icons. "I need a favor," Frank said, and his voice had something in it Carson had never heard before. Something raw. Something unguarded. Carson gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Frank sat. He unfolded the paper. It was a letter. Handwritten. Old. The creases were deep, like it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. "This," Frank said, "is from a kid. Name's Michael. He's 12. Leukemia. He wrote to me 6 months ago. Asked if I'd ever meet him. I said yes. I said I'd come to his house when I was in Arizona." Frank paused. His jaw tightened. "I didn't make it. The tour ran long. By the time I got there, he was gone. His mother sent me this. It's the last thing he wrote. It's addressed to me. And to you." Carson took the letter. His hands were steady, but his eyes weren't. He read it silently. It was simple. A child's handwriting. Blue ink. Some words misspelled. "Dear Mr. Sinatra and Mr. Carson, you are my two favorite people. If I could have one wish, it would be to see you both together one time. That would make everything okay. Love, Michael." Carson folded the letter carefully. He handed it back. "What do you need, Frank?" "I need you to let me walk onto your show tonight. No announcement. No plan. I just need to walk out there and exist with you for 5 minutes. For that kid. Because I didn't show up when it mattered. And maybe this doesn't fix it. But maybe it's something." Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Carson stood. "You don't walk out there, Frank. We walk out there. Together." But Sinatra shook his head. "No. You do your monologue. You do your thing. And then I'll come out. When you least expect it. When the audience least expects it. Because that's what the kid wanted. A surprise. Something that felt like magic." Carson understood. He nodded. "Okay." At 5:30 p.m., Carson stood behind the curtain. Ed warmed up the audience. Doc and the band ran through the opening music. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. Except Carson's right hand, which held a folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket. Michael's letter. Frank had let him keep a copy. The show began. Monologue. Jokes. Laughter. Carson hit every beat. But there was something in his eyes. Something the audience couldn't name but could feel. A weight. A presence. He was halfway through a bit about President Ford when he saw Frank in his peripheral vision. Standing just off stage. Waiting. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Carson finished the joke. The audience laughed. And then he did something he never done in 15 years of hosting The Tonight Show. He stopped. Mid-sentence. Mid-thought. He just stopped. He turned slightly toward stage left. The audience followed his gaze. The laughter died. Confusion rippled through the crowd. And then Frank Sinatra walked out. No music. No introduction. Just footsteps on the stage floor. Sinatra walked slowly, deliberately, until he stood next to Carson's desk. He didn't sit in the guest chair. He stood. He looked at Carson. Carson looked at him. The silence was deafening. Ed McMahon's mouth was open. Doc Severinsen had lowered his trumpet. The cameras didn't know where to point. The producers in the booth were frozen, hands hovering over buttons they didn't know whether to press. And then Carson did something no one expected. He stood up. He walked around his desk. He stood next to Sinatra. Two icons. 2 generations. 2 men connected by a boy who never got his wish. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Carson reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the letter. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't explain it. He simply held it up, so the cameras could see it. So the audience could see a child's handwriting. So America could see proof that something mattered. Sinatra's hand moved to his own pocket. He pulled out a small photograph. He held it up next to the letter. It was a picture of a boy. Smiling. 12 years old? Michael. Still, either man spoke. The audience understood before the cameras did. Some unspoken agreement. Some shared grief. Some understanding that words would only diminish what was happening. A woman in the third row started crying. Then another. Then a man in the back stood up. Then another. Then the entire audience was on its feet, not applauding, just standing, bearing witness. Doc Severinsen, without any cue from anyone, lifted his trumpet and played something soft. Something Sinatra had sung 1,000 times. One for my baby. Just a few notes. Quiet. Reverent. And then Sinatra spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in that silent studio, it carried like thunder. His name was Michael. He loved this show. He loved Johnny. He loved music. He loved life. And I was supposed to meet him. And I didn't. And I can't fix that. But Johnny and I, we're here now. Together. Like he wanted. And if there's any chance he can see this, if there's any justice in the universe, then maybe this counts for something. Carson's voice was thick when he finally spoke. It counts, Frank. It counts. Sinatra nodded. He looked at the audience. Thank you for letting me interrupt your Tuesday night. He turned. He walked off stage the same way he'd entered. Quiet. Alone. Carrying the weight of a promise unkept but honored in the only way left. Carson stood at his desk. He didn't sit. He didn't move. He just stood there, holding that letter, while the audience continued to stand with him. Finally, after what felt like an hour but was only 45 seconds, Carson spoke. We'll be right back. The show cut to commercial. But NBC received over 3,000 phone calls during that break. Viewers asking what had just happened. Viewers crying. Viewers wanting to know about Michael. When the show came back, Carson didn't explain. He didn't need to. He just moved on to the next segment. But his hand kept reaching into his pocket, touching that letter, making sure it was still there. After the show, Carson went to his dressing room. Frank was gone. But there was something on Carson's desk. The photograph of Michael. On the back, in Sinatra's handwriting, keep this. Remember him. Make sure they all remember him. Carson framed that photograph. He hung it in his dressing room, where it stayed for the next 16 years until his final episode in 1992. In interviews years later, Carson rarely talked about that night. When asked, he'd only say, "Some things are bigger than television. Some things are bigger than entertainment. That was one of them." Frank Sinatra never publicly discussed it either. But those who knew him said he carried Michael's letter until the day he died. Folded. Worn. A reminder that fame means nothing if you can't show up for the people who need you. The footage of that night has been watched millions of times. No music video. No viral clip. Just two men, standing in silence, holding a letter and a photograph. Proof that sometimes the most powerful television happens when you stop performing and start being human. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Michael's mother, contacted years later, said she'd watched that episode. She said it was the first time she'd smiled since losing her son. She said seeing two men her son admired honor his memory gave her something she didn't know she needed, proof that her son mattered beyond her own grief. Carson kept that letter in his pocket for months after that night. Stage hands reported seeing him take it out between tapings, reading it, folding it carefully back up. Ed McMahon once asked him about it. Carson just said, "It's a reminder that this job, this platform, it's not about me. It's about moments like that." The impact of that night rippled through television. Other hosts started taking chances. Letterman would later break format to honor Fred Rogers. Kimmel would give tearful monologues about his son's health. Colbert would drop his character to grieve. They all traced their willingness to be vulnerable back to Carson. Back to that October night when he stopped being a host and became a human being. Frank Sinatra's last performance was in 1995. His voice was failing. His memory was slipping. But those close to him said he still carried Michael's letter. Still touched his pocket to make sure it was there. Still whispered the boy's name like a prayer. When Sinatra died in 1998, they found the letter among his personal effects. His family donated it to the Library of Congress, along with a note explaining its significance. Today it sits in a climate-controlled archive, preserved forever. A 12-year-old's handwriting. A wish that came true too late, and just in time. Johnny Carson died in 2005. Among his personal effects, his family found the photograph Frank had given him. On the back, Carson had added his own note beneath Sinatra's. Michael made me remember why I do this. Not for the laughs. Not for the ratings. For the connection. Always the connection. That photograph now hangs in the Paley Center for Media in Los Angeles. Next to it, a placard reads, "In memory of Michael, and every viewer who reminded us that television, at its best, is about empathy." The Tonight Show studio where it happened, Studio One at NBC Burbank, was renovated in 2007. But the production team kept one detail, a small brass plaque on the stage floor, exactly where Sinatra stood that night. It reads simply, "Here. October 1976. For Michael." Young hosts still visit that spot. Fallon has stood there. Colbert has knelt there. They don't do it for cameras. They do it to remember what the job is really about. The lesson Carson and Sinatra taught that night wasn't about show business. It was about showing up. Even when it's too late. Even when it hurts. Even when there's no applause. Because sometimes, the most powerful moment on television is when you stop performing and just stand there, holding a letter from a boy who never got to see his heroes together. Until that night, when he did.